Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to take you through the step-by-step process of setting up interactive dashboards in Excel. These will be reasonably advanced looking dashboards. However, the nice thing about these is that they won't use any formulas at all, which means they're extremely accessible to beginner Excel users or advanced Excel users alike. Even if you are an advanced Excel user, pay close attention to how I put these dashboards together. The structure and architecture of these dashboards are actually designed in a special way that will make your models more robust and easier to refresh. I'll be starting by loading up a raw dataset using Power Query, and if you're not already familiar with this feature, the significance of this will become more apparent in future lectures. So to build our pivot table, let's go ahead and load in our data into a table using Power Query. So I'm going to come over to Data, Get Data, from File, from Text, and select our file Employees 2017. I'm going to come over here and click Load. All of our data has been loaded into a table called Employees 2017. I'm just going to make this name more generic by getting rid of the date and just calling this Employees. Let's collapse our connections here. Zoom out a little and take a look at our data. Now that we have our data in place, I can go to Insert, Pivot Table. And you notice here, because our table has a name, Employees, our pivot table references that name, which is really useful. Every time we update our data in Power Query by hitting the refresh button, it will automatically update our pivot tables. I'm going to come over, click OK, and let's take a look to see what we can do with our data. Over here, I have a department, so that looks like it could be a good grouping. I can see here that if I select all of these, I have 30 different departments. Let's add a head count on the side here. Now, a grouping with 30 different items is often too many to stick into a summary. So what we might want to do is just view the top 10 items. To do that, I can come over to here and I can click this drop down, come to Value Filters, and select Top 10. I can change the number of items I want to display here and the metric I want to display and click OK. And there is my top 10 items. Let's sort this in descending order, so I can right click on this and I can go sort and I can go largest to smallest. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here when you do groupings, it can end up changing the size of your column width, which if you're starting to build dashboards, it can really mess around with your layouts, which can be quite a pain, especially if you spent a long time getting everything just right. To avoid this issue, what you can do is you can come over to the Pivot Table Tools options and deselect this option, Auto Fit Column Widths on Update, and click OK. Now every time that you change these filters, the column widths will stay fixed. Now in this example, we used the top 10 items or the top 10 departments. The problem with this view is that it truncates some of our data. So we used to have 16,000 records and now we only have around 13,000. So the other thing that we might want to do with this is to take our top 10 items and then group everything else into a grouping called Other. To do that, I'm going to copy this table. I'm going to paste a copy over here, remove my grouping. And what I'm going to do this time is use a grouping called Group by Text. So I've got my top 10 items here. So I'm going to take all of these values. Now all of these values are in a single range here. If I want to select another value, which is not part of this continuous range, I can just use the Control key to say select this item as well, and right click, and then I can click Group. Now that's going to add everything to this group called Group 1. Let me rename this to Other and hit Enter. I'm then going to come over to here and collapse all of these. Now you notice here that what's happened to our pivot table, it's actually added an additional field. The field inside our table was called department, and now I have this extra field called department 2, which includes this value of other. We can see that over here as well, so let's go ahead and get rid of that. And let's reapply a sort to this data here. The other thing I want to do to this summary is add an annual total pay over here. So I've got the sum here. Now you'll notice here that this value is very big, so it doesn't really display very well. Let's see if we can go into the number formatting to clean this up. Now, when formatting the numbers in the pivot table, it's really important that you come over to here, right click, and click number formatting like this inside the pivot table. This formats the fields inside the pivot table, as opposed to me coming over here, selecting these cells, and coming over to home and using these formatting options here. What happens is if I format my data this way, my formatting is only applied to these 10 cells, and if my pivot table changes in size, then I'm not going to have the correct cells formatted. So the correct way to do this is to come over and click number format. Now, because I have quite a large value over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a custom format, and I'm going to come over to here. This hash comma hash hash adds these comma between the as a thousands separator here. Now what you can do is by coming to the end of this and adding a comma, I've now turned that into thousands. Add another comma, and that's millions. I'm going to add inside here quotes M, so I know what the scale is, and click OK. So now here I can see I've got 229 million. Let's do something similar for the head count. So let's come over to here, number format, custom. And this time I have a smaller number. So let's say I want this to show as 3.9 million. So I want to add a decimal place to this. So to do that, I can add 0.0 before adding my comma, and this is now 3.9 thousand. Again, let's add in quotes K to the end of this so that I know what the scale is that we're dealing with. Let's now update some of these labels so they're a little easier to read. Let's change that to head count, and let's change that to pay. Let's go ahead and visualize this data using a pivot chart. And for this, I'm going to use a special type of pie chart called a donut. And I'm going to click OK. Now, the nice thing about this here is we've got our head count on the inside here, and we have our pay on the outside here. And what you can see from this is the proportion of head count versus the proportion of pay. So let me just add the labels on here, just make this a little easier to read. So add data labels to the inside, data labels to the outside. And let's just change that color to something slightly easier to see. That's better. So we can see here, because the inside ring is smaller than the outside ring, we can see that a smaller percentage of the population is getting a larger percentage of the pay. So let's go to this next chunk of the ring over here. So 3,500 head count, which makes up 21% of the population, is receiving 153 million, which is only 18% of the pay. So an interesting piece of analysis that you can do here. While we're here, let us label our charts. I'm going to add a chart element. I'm going to add a chart title. Yep, I think that looks good there. Let us call this cost versus headcount. Okay, so that is using a group by text. Now there's two other types of groupings that we can use inside a pivot table. One of them is group by number and the other one is group by date. So let's take a look at those now. Again, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to copy and paste my pivot table. In this example, I'm going to get rid of my department grouping, and I'm going to take the pay and stick it into the rows. Now, to start with, this looks pretty useless because this is every unique combination of pay that somebody gets paid. So to make this more useful, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to here. I'm going to right click and go to group. And what I can see here is I can see the lowest somebody got paid, the highest somebody got paid. And what this is going to do is it's going to increment all these values from this value to this value using this amount here. I'm going to update this to a nicer to read format. So I'm going to change the lowest value to 10,000. I'm going to change the highest value to 100,000. Now, I know this isn't the highest value, but what this will do is it will create another bucket, which is everybody who earns over 100,000. I'm going to change the increment to 10,000 and click OK. So what we get is this view here where we can see how many people are in each of these different pay brackets. Let's do another little update to this value here. So far we've been using sums for headcount and pay. Let's use something a little different. Let's use average pay. And this time the number format is going to be a little bit different. Let me, because we're still in millions here, so the scale is a bit off. Get rid of one of those and put K there instead. And click OK. And let's rename this to average pay. Let's visualize this with a pivot chart. So to start with, I'm just going to select this option column. Now, what we can see here is that because these two values have such different scales, this becomes very difficult to read. It's not very useful. To change this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here, right click, and I'm going to change my chart type to a combo. And what I can do here is I can say, okay, well, the first series here, headcount, is a clustered column, and my second one, average pay, let's change that to a line with markers, and let's stick that on the secondary axis here. So now I've got two separate scales on the left and the right. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. That's looking a bit better. I like to move these, so if I come over to Format Legend, I can get rid of that now. I can maybe move that to the top. Gives me a little bit more real estate for my chart. A few formatting options that you can do here. So I can come over to here and I can say get rid of the line. Oops. Sometimes it can be a little fidgety selecting the specific elements of the chart. Sometimes you end up only selecting a single item, whereas you want the whole series. So let me use this drop down to help me select it. I'm going to come over to here and I'm going to click no line, and that gets rid of the line there. Let's adjust a few of the other settings. Over here I have markers, so I can click marker options and I could change this shape to maybe something like a diamond and make that a little bit bigger. I can also come over here, I can add my labels. I can also come over here, add a trend line. Let's come over to our other series. We can add a trend line for this as well. Now you notice here that the default for trend line is linear. It makes less sense for this sort of distribution here. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use a moving average. And now this is looking pretty decent. Let's finish off by adding a chart title. Let's call this chart title pay distribution. Now, a final type of chart is going to be using group by dates. So if I come over here, I'm going to copy and paste my pivot table again. Get rid of the annual pay from the rows. I'm going to get rid of this average pay for this example. And I'm going to drag on hire dates into the rows. Now you can see in Excel 2016, automatically done this nice date grouping for me. where things are grouped automatically into years, quarters, and months. Now, if you try this on your data and this doesn't seem to be working, the most probable reason is that there are blank or missing dates from your date column. So if I come back to my data set for a sec here, and I come over to hire date and I say deleted some of these, and I came back to my pivot table and hit refresh, you can see that this has lost its grouping and it dropped back into the dates and it has this blank value here. So we can also apply a grouping, and this is how you would have done date grouping in previous versions of Excel, by coming over to here and hitting group and selecting months, quarters, and years. Click OK, and you now have this grouping with all years and including this extra value up here, which is less than 2015, which effectively contains our blank values. Let me just undo all of that. So I just want to add my values back in here. Now, even if you do have all the values in here, the other reason why this doesn't work sometimes is that when people set up their pivot tables, instead of using a table, they select the entire column. And by selecting the entire column, you have the header value, which is not a date, and you have basically the blank cells at the end of your range at the bottom of the sheet, which are blanks and also not dates, which is another reason why this sometimes doesn't work. Anyway, for now, we are going to come back to our date pivot table, and we're going to see if we can look at some of the trends in this data. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of the quarters, and I'm going to take the years and I'm going to drag it into the columns. We can start to see a little bit of the trends that are going on with the data here. But to help us better visualize this, let's go ahead and add a pivot chart. And I'm going to click OK. So here, we can see we have our 3 years. We can see that there's been a steady increase of hiring from 2015 to 16 to 17. But you can also see here that there is quite a distinct trend where there seems to be more hiring at the beginning of the year, which then drops off and slowly increases to the middle of the year and then slowly drops off again till the end of the year. Let me just clean this chart up a little bit. I'm going to format my legend, add this to the top, and I'm also going to add a chart title. So design element chart title, stick it there. Yeah, that looks good. Let's call that seasonal hiring trends. Maybe I can move this to the bottom to make it a little bit more balanced. And there we go. So now that I have my 3 different charts in place, let's see if we can lay these out nicely and add some interactivity in a dashboard form by using some slicers. Now, to lay these out nicely, a few tricks that you can use is if I use the Alt key when I'm resizing or moving a chart item, it's going to snap in place to the cells. So you can see here when I move this and resize this while holding it down, you can see that these line up perfectly within the cells, which makes it a lot easier to lay out. Let's move that over there. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. Now if I select one of my charts and come over to analyze, I can see here that I've got this option called insert slicer. So I've come over and clicked this. I now have a selection for all the different fields or columns that I have in my table. So here I could say add county and department and click OK. So let's stick county over here. Let's make this a bit bigger. Department over here. Let's format these to make them look a bit nicer. So I can add color to this, so say yellow, and we'll increase the number of columns here to say 4. Department, make this green, add a few more columns. Now with slicers, there's this option called report connections. So you can see here that the report connections for department is pointing to a specific pivot table, basically the one that we selected earlier. But the beauty of slicers is that they can connect to multiple pivot tables and update them all at once. So if I tick the box for all of these pivot tables, and I'm going to do the same thing here for county. Now all of these items are linked. So whenever I look at, say, one county, it updates all of my charts. I can also see here that Beaverhead has these 9 departments in it, and not these other ones down below here. Change the slicer, see all of the departments, and all of the updated values here as well. So the last type of slicer that I'm going to add here is a special type of slicer called a timeline. So to do this, I just need to make sure that I have one of my pivot charts or pivot tables selected. Under pivot charts, I can come to analyze and I can go timeline. So here we can see that this only applies to date fields, which is why I can only see the higher date field here. I'm going to select this and click OK. And I'm just going to scroll up a little bit so that I can place this at the top of my chart. And here we have this little drop down option for whether we want to view this by years, quarters, months, or days. So I think this looks pretty good here with the months and years across here. And as with all the slicers, we just need to make sure that we update the report connections so that it applies to all of our pivot tables. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now every time I make a date selection here, it updates the data accordingly here.